I think we're starting to see the beginning of the implosion of Hollywood. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black. Get your copy today at your favorite online bookseller. AT&T is preparing to spin off Warner Media in a business deal with Discovery. Now, 3 years ago, AT&T bought all of Warner Media's assets in a hope to go out here and compete with streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon Prime. And the plan was to take the large media catalog from AT&T and use it as part of a plan to build the HBO Max streaming service and capitalize on all of those cell phone and internet users. Unfortunately, it looks like your AT&T has not been able to pull a profit with their plans, and now they're backtracking from those plans. And when I take a critical examination of your Warner Media being spun off by Discovery, it just shows how we're starting to see the beginning, as I see it, of the end of Hollywood as it was. And the reason why I say we're starting to see the beginning of the end of Hollywood is because we're seeing these big media companies starting to have a hard time surviving in the changing media marketplace. Now, I believe we started to see the decline of Hollywood when Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress signed the Telecommunications Bill of 1996. That bill, which deregulated American media, allowed companies to go out here and buy up all of these television stations, radio stations, and newspapers, and it allowed for the conglomeration of media. And as a result, we wound up with 6 companies controlling the media, and in recent years, it has practically declined to 4 companies controlling the media. Unfortunately, as these big companies have controlled most of the media institutions of mainstream media, they have not really been able to adapt to the changing marketplace. Now, that marketplace started to really change in 2009 when we went from the analog television system to the digital television system. And when we changed from the analog television system to the digital, what happened was we had the TV networks go out here and force many of the viewers to go buy new televisions and buy converter boxes, but in order to watch their television with all of these different sub channels. But all that did was create a more saturated marketplace, which already had 500 cable channels, and now was adding hundreds more broadcast channels, making the pie even smaller for many of these mainstream media platforms. Even worse, as related to this digital conversion, we were starting to see the internet grow into its own. And as sites like YouTube started to emerge as platforms for people to broadcast themselves, more people were more interested in sitting in front of a camera to make their own content rather than sit there and watch most of the manufactured media produced by the then Big Six. And over the past decade, that whole problem with the mainstream media is more and more people are tuning in to alternative platforms like YouTube and watching content that is freshly produced on streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon Prime. And your Warner Media just hasn't been able to catch up. And the same thing is happening to Disney, which also reported a $600 million loss. Many of these big media companies, they just aren't nimble enough to maneuver around on the internet. And as a result, many of these companies are struggling. And the main reason why they are struggling is because, one, many of these companies in their mergers took out huge loans like your AT&T did in order to buy Warner Media's assets, and what your Disney did in order to buy all of Fox's assets. And those loans proved to be problematic because many of these companies, they were buying these catalogs in the hopes of having valuable assets long term. But what they didn't understand is many of the intellectual properties they were buying had already depreciated in value because many of these Hollywood executives were thinking that many of the IPs they were buying, such as when Disney bought Fox, they bought Alien and Predator and The Simpsons, thought they had valuable catalogs, but they did not really look at the context of time as related to those intellectual properties. Because once you take a critical examination of the timeline, you start to see that Alien came out in 1979 and it's now past 2019, so that property is practically 40 plus years old, and Predator is plus 30 plus years old, and The Simpsons is 35 years old. So a lot of these properties have lost lots of value because the audience that watched them are now in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. So those IPs don't have the value that they once did when they came out in the 80s. So they were big hits in the 70s and the 80s, but to today's audiences, those are grandpa's intellectual properties, and that was part of grandpa's experience growing up. So a lot of these media companies like AT&T and Disney are hemorrhaging money because they're trying to make money on older properties, and because they're trying to make money on older properties and they've taken out these loans, they are struggling to stay afloat because the debt is overwhelming them. And they were thinking, oh, like AT&T thought, we'll open up with HBO Max in an effort to try to get more viewers. But the big problem with that idea was the content they had was extremely old. I mean, many of these movies that they had on HBO Max, they ranged anywhere from 30 to maybe even 70 years old. And while many of these movies are classic films or memorable films, to today's tech generation, many of these films, again, were grandpa and even great-grandpa's movies. So yes, they were culturally relevant to previous generations, but to today's generation, they didn't have much value. And when you're out here doing streams or you're on the internet, the big thing with the internet is content is king. And if you don't have fresh content, then you're not going to be able to compete. Now, many of these TV networks out here, they were able to compete with older content back in the day because the market was more concentrated, because in that era, when you had 3 channels, like places here like New York and a couple of indie channels, you only had an audience that was only watching maybe 20% of one channel. But when you had a 500 channel universe in the 90s, that pie started to get smaller. And then when you had TV go digital and we went from 500 to 1,000 channels and the internet, that pie got even smaller. And with streaming, the pie is practically a sliver at this point. So you have more content than viewers at this point. And this is one of the things that has many in the entertainment industry struggling, but they don't really see where the problem is. The problem is you're trying to buy all of these assets as related to old content in an effort to try to contain and control old copyrights and old intellectual properties, not understanding a lot of that property has lost value over time, and this is why you're not able to make much money. Now, when it comes down to much of their new content, you don't really get to see too much of it. And a whole thing is, if you don't have a lot of fresh content on a place like a HBO Max, a Netflix, or Amazon Prime, you're not going to get the viewers. And HBO Max had the least amount of content as related to fresh new content, and that's why they only have 44 million subscribers in comparison to Hulu or your Amazon Prime or your Netflix. But there's not really that much pie to go around, and that's the big problem as related to Hollywood media. They've practically cut the pie so thin that next to no one can really go out here and build an audience on any of these platforms. I mean, when you've got over 1,000 cable and broadcast channels, that's just way too many for one set of eyes to watch in a day, and that's more than enough content for even the average person to consume in a lifetime. And that's one of the big problems that they're having ever since they passed that telecommunications bill of 1996 that deregulated the marketplace. Ever since we got that deregulation of the marketplace, yes, they've gone out here and created this corporate oligarchy as related to media, but that oligarchy has not really been able to build any momentum because it's a big, large institution, and it's a big, large institution that moves very slowly as related to change, and it's not really as nimble as the old television networks were, like CBS, NBC, and ABC, or even local channels like here, like WPIX or WNYW back in the day, which became Fox. Those smaller networks, they could go out here and adapt on the fly by creating fresh content, either through local shows or syndicated shows, to be able to capitalize on an audience. But when you have a large corporation, it's hard to be nimble and quick, and it's hard to go out here and be able to adapt on the fly and go out here and create new content, or even invest in those like myself who create new content. And that's one of the big problems, again, because when it comes down to streaming and the internet, content is king, and if you don't have fresh new content, then you're not going to get today's new viewers. Yes, there's a market for older content, but most corporations, again, when you're making entertainment, you want fresh new content because most of your viewers you want are the young viewers. And the big problem with many of these big media companies is they have all of this old depreciated content they're trying to push when they need more fresh new content. And the problem is they're not making enough fresh new content in order to compete with Netflix, which already had a head start, or Amazon Prime, which has a head start. So that's one of the problems that Disney is struggling with, and your HBO and AT&T are struggling with. And they're hoping that, spinning it off and sending it to Discovery will help, but it's not really going to help, because the big problem with your HBO Max and AT&T was that, again, they have a lot of old intellectual properties, and those old intellectual properties, they have depreciated in value to the point where, yes, they're on your platform and people are subscribing to your platform, but when people start seeing 35, 40, 50, and even 70-year-old movies, they really don't have an incentive to watch that, because that's grandpa and great-grandpa's content. And even stuff from 20 years ago, they're saying, hey, that's my dad's content. So a lot of the viewers are looking for that fresh new content. And again, when you're driving a platform, you need fresh, new, original content. And this is what is the big problem. And it's the bigger problem is these streaming services, I don't think are going to survive much longer, because again, Disney took out a lot of money to loans to buy all that Fox catalog, and AT&T went out here and spent a lot of money on loans. So many of these companies, they are practically on the brink as it is. And when I look at the whole Hollywood platform, everything is on the brink of collapse. And it looks like they might have started that whole domino effect once they passed that telecommunications bill of 1996, which deregulated American media. And as these companies ate each other up, eventually they started to get to a point where they started to get really unstable, and their platforms are now looking like they're about to shake because there's just so much weight on them, and it looks like the whole thing is about to implode. And the reason why it looks like it's about to implode is because you have these big companies, and these big companies just don't have any leadership like a Brandon Tartikoff with the vision to go out here and invest in fresh content. They don't have a direction as related to what type of content they want to produce, and they have people who are running content that tries to pander to audiences like those in certain organizations like Disney. They want to produce these social justice type narratives that alienate viewers, and the whole platform just can't stay afloat much longer because the millions you spend on failing shows like your Batwomans and many of your things like the latest Star Wars and many of these what they call social justice type content or really bad movies, eventually you cannot afford to stay in business much longer. And when I look at today's media from the mainstream media, that it's looking more and more like the dark days of the late 60s and early 70s. And sadly, this time there won't be any, as I see it, black people to come save them or any new audiences to come save them, because Hollywood just doesn't want to invest in visionaries and original creators these days. And most creators these days are moving towards alternative platforms and getting their content out on those alternative platforms. So I think we're at this point where we might be seeing the last days of Hollywood, because your entertainment industry wound up becoming too large, too bloated, and wound up spending itself into an oblivion, where it wound up, instead of exploding into becoming an international juggernaut, started to implode because it just spent so much money on content that was on old content, and then spent so much money on making the same type of movies over and over again that it doesn't know how to create or be creative. And that's why so many people are not watching anything that comes from Hollywood anymore, because they don't see themselves, they don't see their life experiences, they don't see their stories, and that's why many people are tuning out of mainstream media and tuning into media by creators like myself on platforms like this. Now, if you want to see me make more content like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, which feature positive images of black people, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Smith-Dorella trilogy, you can find all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spinsterella. Discover the dark side of love in this goth and lovely romance with Spinsterella. Get Spinsterella in paperback and e-readers at your favorite online bookseller today.